Charity is no substitute for justice withheld. Quote from Saint Augustine. The Catholic Men's Podcast, Episode 32, Lincoln's Grave Robbers. I would categorize today's tale as stories that every young man should know about history. Lincoln's Grave Robbers by Steve Sheinkin is an excellent book about counterfeiters, the Secret Service, the Civil War, and a weird plot to steal a certain American president's body. It's a really immersive book, and I found myself falling into the story as I read it, and I think you will too. It's one of those stories that should totally be told around a campfire in the summer with s'mores, or next to a fireplace on a cold winter night with a hot cider in your hand. It's that good. This is Lincoln's Grave Robbers by Steve Sheinkin. A passenger train rattled through the woods of western Pennsylvania late one summer night in 1864. In the rear car sat a man with a black beard. Iron shackles and chains bound his wrists and ankles. Armed guards sat on either side of him. The train was on its way to Washington, D.C. Pete McCartney was headed for the dreaded old Capitol Prison, or so it appeared. The prisoner turned and looked through the open door at the rear of the car. Judging by the speed the train slid past moonlit clumps of trees, he figured they were doing 35 miles an hour, a bit fast for what he needed to do. He glanced at the guards, one seated beside him, another across the aisle. Each seemed lost in his own thoughts. McCartney sprang up. He stumbled and slid on short steps, chains clanking, down the aisle and through the open door. The guards dashed onto the platform just in time to see the prisoner dive over the side and smack the gravel slope along the tracks and disappear into darkness. One of the soldiers lunged for the alarm cord strung along the side of the car. The steam whistle on the roof let loose an ear-splitting blast, and the train began screeching to a stop. "What is it?" asked the startled passenger. "McCartney has escaped," yelled one of the guards. "And who is McCartney? How has he escaped?" "Gone out at the car door," the guard shouted. "When?" "Now, this moment." "While the train was in motion?" asked the stunned conductor. "Confound that fella," grunted one of the guards as he jumped from the slowing train. "Well, he's smashed every bone in his skin at all events," the other said as he jumped. They hurried back along the dark tracks, swinging lanterns, expecting to come quickly to the prisoner's mangled body, but there was no sign of him. "I was hurt, of course," McCartney later said of his midnight leap, "but I fled to the woods, waited till all was quiet, and the train had gone, struggled along for hours, skulked and secreted myself, and with a stone finally smashed the iron shackles from my limbs." McCartney was hungry, bruised as a rotting apple, and lost somewhere in the forest far from home, but he wasn't going to jail, and that's all that mattered. Pete McCartney was a counterfeiter, a coney man as government agents called them. He'd been arrested many times for making and passing fake money, but had always found ways to wriggle free. McCartney busted out of one prison by patiently collecting foil from the insides of tobacco packages, melting the metal with a candle, and molding it into a key to his jail cell. Usually his method of escape was a lot simpler. He bought his way out. "I was always a cash man, you know," McCartney bragged. "I have paid away over $70,000 first and last in good money to escape the clutches of the law." He wasn't sure he could bribe his way out of the old Capitol Prison, which explains the dangerous train escape. After such a close call on the train, McCartney tried to go straight. He drifted back to his native Midwest and opened a photography studio. Then he moved to another town and bought a livery stable. Knowing the police were after him, he couldn't stay in one place. "I practiced dentistry for a while," he said, "but this was too slow for me." He even earned money as a traveling lecturer, giving talks on the art of detecting counterfeit currency. But the lure of easy money was too strong. He started counterfeiting again. "I shoved a good many notes as I traveled," admitted McCartney. "The officers got on to my trail." He was arrested in Cincinnati, escaped, was recaptured in Illinois, and taken to jail in the state capital of Springfield. When the news reached Washington, D.C., an excited Herman Whitley hopped on a train and headed west. An ex-Union Army officer, Whitley was now chief of the United States Secret Service, a new government agency in charge of battling counterfeiters. He knew all about Pete McCartney and was eager to question him. Whitley's interview with the Coney man was a bit disappointing. McCartney offered to turn over his stash of bogus cash, but refused to squeal on other well-known counterfeiters. The chief got up to leave. "You won't leave me here, I suppose?" McCartney asked. "Yes, for the present," said Whitley. "You're safe here." "Oh, I can get out of this place easy enough," McCartney said, grinning. "I have done so before, and I can do it again." "I guess not," Whitley said. "Where are you stopping, Colonel?" Whitley mentioned the name of his hotel. "Your number?" "Room 24. "Thank you," said McCartney. "I will call on you at 10. Whitley smiled. He could enjoy a good joke, even from a crook. "Good night," he said. At 10 o'clock that night, Whitley was sitting at the desk in his hotel room, writing up a report. There was a gentle knock on the door. "Come in," said the chief. The door opened. A voice sang out, "Good evening, Colonel." Whitley turned to his guest. "McCartney," he shouted, drawing his revolver. "How are you here?" "Put up your shooting iron, Colonel," McCartney said. "I merely called to pay my respects. I'm going back, of course." And McCartney really did walk back to prison, smiling all the way. Herman Whitley never did figure out how McCartney got out of jail that night. However he did it, the stunt illustrated a serious challenge facing the U.S. government in the 1870s. The Secret Service was absolutely determined to catch counterfeiters and keep them behind bars. But Coney men were just as eager to get free, and they were good at it too. On a freezing morning in February 1875, Patrick Tyrrell hopped off a streetcar in downtown Chicago, Illinois. A massive fire had gutted the city just 4 years before, but Chicago was already roaring back to life. Stone buildings were rising all around, and the sidewalks were jammed with people in a hurry. Tyrrell stepped through the doors of the newly rebuilt Palmer House Hotel and stood in the cavernous lobby. With its shining marble, glittering chandeliers, and columns reaching up to soaring ceilings, the place looked more like an overgrown palace than a hotel. But Tyrrell wasn't here to admire the architecture. He asked a clerk for the room number of his boss, the new Secret Service chief, Elmer Washburn. A powerfully built man with thick black hair, Tyrrell had spent his adult life chasing down crooks as a Chicago detective. Now 44, he was one of the newest operatives of the United States Secret Service. He knew all about Coney men like Pete McCartney. It was his job to put them out of business. The operative found Washburn's room, and the two men sat down to talk. The subject was the usual one, counterfeiters and how to nab them. Specifically, Washburn had taken the train from Washington to talk to Tyrrell about a particularly dangerous Coney man, an expert engraver and brother-in-law to Pete McCartney. The man was an even bigger thorn in the government's side than McCartney. In fact, he was a threat to the nation's entire economic system. His name was Benjamin Boyd. Boyd was the son of a master engraver. Engravers cut designs and pictures into metal plates, and the plates were then used to make prints on paper. Young Ben showed interest in his father's craft and obvious artistic talent. When Ben was still a teenager, his father set him up to study with one of the city's best engravers. The plan was that one day Ben would take over the family's business. Other Cincinnati engravers noticed Boyd's skill, and one of them, Nat Kinsey, offered to teach the kid a few advanced techniques. Kinsey was known for his beautifully intricate engravings of landscapes. It was less well known that with that same steady hand and attention to detail, he also cut plates to print counterfeit money. Ben was tempted by the idea of making money, literally making it, and he learned quickly from Kinsey. At the age of 20, hunched over the desk in his room at his father's house, he cut his first 2 counterfeit plates, the front and back of a $20 bill. The quality of this 20 was Boyd's ticket into the secret world of counterfeiting. He hopped around the Midwest, cutting plates and printing Coney. Distributors bought the goods from him, usually for at least 15% of the fake money's face value. Distributors then doubled the price and sold the bills to shovers, whose job it was to pass the counterfeit cash in stores and banks. The potential profits were enormous. From just one set of $50 plates, Boyd printed 265,000, about $6 million in today's money. But it was a risky way to get rich. Boyd was arrested in Iowa in 1859 and sentenced to 2 years in the state penitentiary. After his release, Boyd moved to Illinois and went right back to cutting counterfeit plates. At some point in the early 1860s, Boyd met a young woman named Almiranda Ackman, a pretty brunette, according to a later Secret Service report. Allie's father was yet another talented engraver gone wrong. Allie and her sister Martha had grown up helping their dad print and pass Coney in Indianapolis. Pete McCartney married Martha, and Ben fell for Allie. Ben and Allie started working together. He made the bills, she carried them to distributors in her straw shopping basket. Secret Service agents tracked the fake money to Mattoon and busted Boyd in his workshop. At the same time, another team of agents burst into a nearby hotel and grabbed Allie Ackman. When detectives searched Allie's basket, they found $30,000 in phony 50s, 20s, and 10s. It was a tight spot, but Ben managed to get both himself and his girl off the hook by agreeing to hand over a set of plates for printing $50 bills. The beautifully cut plates had taken about a year of painstaking labor to make. Free again, Ben and Allie were married in Michigan. From 1865 to 1875, the Boyds kept out of sight. But the Secret Service knew Boyd was still out there somewhere, and they knew he was still working because his nearly perfect counterfeit money kept showing up all over the Midwest. Boyd's masterpiece was a $5 bill that even some experts couldn't tell was fake. As one official report put it, he is considered the best letterer on steel in the country or the world. After reviewing the case, Secret Service Chief Washburn gave Patrick Tyrrell his new assignment. He was to track down Ben Boyd and get him dead to rights, grab him with incriminating evidence on him. A veteran of the Chicago Police Department, Tyrrell knew how things worked in the real world. He needed information about Boyd, and he went to the only people who had it: criminals. Tyrrell contacted Ben's old teacher, Nat Kinsey. Kinsey was down on his luck and ready to sell out an old pal for the right price. "I am in need of money in the worst way," Kinsey wrote to Tyrrell in one of many letters they exchanged. Tyrrell discovered that Boyd had lived briefly in Decatur, Illinois as Charles Mitchell and his B.F. Wilson in Des Moines, Iowa. In September, the so-called B.F. Wilson and his wife had left Iowa for Fulton, Illinois, where they rented a white house near the banks of the Mississippi River. Tyrrell headed for Fulton. He found the windows of the Wilsons' house covered by thick green curtains, always drawn. Neighbors said Mrs. Wilson was sometimes seen going to the market, but Mr. Wilson never showed his face. Another man, though, was often seen coming and going. This other man was Nat Kinsey. He was helping Boyd cut plates and secretly sending Tyrrell updates from inside his old student's house. On October 18th, Tyrrell rented a room in Lyons, Iowa, across the river from Fulton. In his daily report to Chief Washburn, he wrote, "I then arranged to make the poll at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." Early the next morning, Tyrrell tucked his revolver into its holster and left his hotel room. A few minutes before 9 o'clock, Tyrrell and the other operatives approached Boyd's house on foot. Kinsey leaned out an upstairs window and gave the go-ahead signal. Suddenly, a man raced up in a wagon and screamed, loud enough to be heard inside the house, "Does B.F. Wilson live here?" Then the driver took off without waiting for an answer. Instantly, Tyrrell knew they'd been spotted by Boyd's friends, and that shouted question was a warning to Boyd. Yelling for the others to stay outside and watch the exits, Tyrrell sprinted to the back door. Just as he was reaching for the doorknob, a man stumbled out, almost crashing into Tyrrell on his way down the steps. It was Kinsey, on his way out. Tyrrell charged through the empty kitchen and into the dining room, running full speed into Allie Boyd. Allie grabbed Tyrrell's coat collar, trying to keep him in the room. "Brooks!" shouted Tyrrell, yanking the woman's strong hands off his collar. James Brooks bolted in, and Tyrrell shoved Allie into his arms. Then Tyrrell spun and ran to the stairs, and was just starting up when he stopped short. Standing at the top of the stairs with a startled look on his face was Benjamin Boyd. Tyrrell pulled out his pistol and said, "Boyd, you are my prisoner." "Who are you?" growled Boyd. "United States Detective Tyrrell." "I have heard of you, Tyrrell," Boyd said, glaring down at the agent. Tyrrell walked up the steps, holstering his revolver. He slapped handcuffs on Boyd's wrists, then shouted out the window for MacDonald, still in the yard, to come inside. While MacDonald and Brooks guarded the prisoners, Tyrrell began the search for incriminating evidence. It was everywhere. The spare bedroom upstairs was clearly being used as a workroom. There was a large table with engraving tools scattered around, as if the worker had just been interrupted. More tools were piled in crates on the floor. Tyrrell lifted a black metal plate from the work table. Cut into the metal was the partially finished design of the front of a U.S. $20 bill. On the desk, right beside where the plate had been, was a real $20 bill. Tyrrell hurried into town to telegraph the good news to Chief Washburn. When he returned to the house to search the downstairs, MacDonald reported an interesting development. While Tyrrell was gone, Allie Boyd had offered MacDonald $1,000 in cash to let her take something out of the house. Tyrrell turned to Allie. What was it she didn't want him to find? She hesitated, sighed, and pointed to a box in the corner. Tyrrell searched it and found nothing interesting. Then he noticed the box had a fat wooden handle. He cracked it open. Inside, in a tightly rolled bundle, was $7,824 in real U.S. currency. The search went on for 6 more hours. I found a small box, Tyrrell reported. On breaking it up, I found a front and back for a $100 treasury note. That afternoon, Tyrrell and the other agents packed up the evidence and headed to the train station with their prisoners. They all sat together on the train back to Chicago. Ben Boyd kept glancing at the crate of counterfeit plates at Tyrrell's feet. There was enough evidence in there to put him away for a long stretch. He turned to the operative. "Tyrrell," Boyd began, "you are not long in the Secret Service, are you?" "No, not long," Tyrrell answered. "Why? Anything the matter?" "Oh, I thought if you were an old member of the Secret Service, you would take the property now in your possession and let me skip out the back door." Tyrrell shook his head. "But that is not my way of doing business." Boyd figured as much. Like other counterfeiters, he'd bribed his way out of jams before, but these new Secret Service agents were annoyingly honest. As if to prove the point, Tyrrell asked Boyd what he wanted done with the money that had been hidden in the hollow box handle. Boyd asked that it be put in the bank for use by his defense lawyer. To Boyd's amazement, Tyrrell deposited every penny. Boyd was convinced he wasn't going to be able to buy his freedom. Plan B was to escape. While awaiting trial in Cook County Jail, Boyd and another counterfeiter in the cell tried to make a key to the cell lock. A guard found the half-cut key and confiscated it. It was beginning to look like Ben Boyd was going to spend a very long time behind bars. After hearing the evidence in the case, Tyrrell grumbled, the judge ordered the jury to find Almiranda Boyd not guilty, it being conceded that she was the wife of Benjamin Boyd, and that as such she had only done what was her duty to her husband by covering up his guilt as much as possible. Allie was acquitted, but the jury took just 20 minutes to find Ben Boyd guilty. The judge sentenced him to 10 years in Joliet State Prison. This was a huge win for Tyrrell. There were a lot of Coney men still out there, Tyrrell knew, and they were sure to strike back. But in a million years, he never could have guessed how they were going to do it. 300 miles to the southwest in St. Louis, Missouri, a livery stable owner named James Canally followed the news from Chicago with increasing alarm. He had good reason to be worried. The arrest and conviction of Ben Boyd threatened to bring down his entire empire. Canally was 37 years old in 1876. He'd done time in prison for horse theft and 2 long stints in the Illinois State Penitentiary for passing counterfeit cash. All that time behind bars taught Canally some valuable lessons. Valuable, that is, to a man determined to continue a life of crime. Canally settled in St. Louis and opened a livery stable with a bit of help from an old friend, none other than Ben Boyd's brother-in-law, Pete McCartney. The stable was really just a front, making it appear to the world that these men were legitimate businessmen. In fact, behind the scenes, Canally set up and managed one of the biggest counterfeiting networks in the Midwest. That's when people started calling him Big Jim. Big Jim had one strict rule. He never touched the stuff himself. Rather than handling piles of potentially incriminating Coney, he accepted orders from counterfeiting gangs around the region. Canally would then contact an engraver and printer, paying them to produce the needed product. When the Coney was ready, he'd have the printer hide the stash in some predetermined spot, in a hollow log out in the country, or in a hole under a roadside rock. The client would be told to pick up his order and to leave his payment. It was all wildly profitable, but the entire operation was based on one simple fact. Canally produced the best, the most realistic-looking Coney available. And he was able to do this for one simple reason. He hired the best engraver, Ben Boyd. Boyd's arrest knocked Canale's system out of joint, and the supply of quality conies circulating in Midwestern cities began to fail. Bank tellers were among the first to notice. Specifically trained to detect counterfeit bills, they were used to spotting about one bogus bill an hour. Now, in the early months of 1876, they might see one a month. New tellers were actually upset by the change. For young tellers, this was an inconvenience. For Big Jim, it was a catastrophe. In early March, he got on a train and rode to Lincoln, Illinois, a town named for the country's 16th president. There he met with members of the Logan County gang, regular customers of his. In flush times, the gang liked to brag that, thanks to them, there was more bogus than real money floating around Logan County. But business was slow now. The men were eager for any kind of work. And it just so happened that Big Jim had a job for them. He wanted them to steal the body of Abraham Lincoln. Certainly, Big Jim knew about the crime of body snatching, which was a serious problem in the 1860s and 70s. Medical colleges were always in need of bodies for use in human anatomy classes. Schools were willing to pay cash for bodies, no questions asked, and body snatchers filled the demand by digging up and delivering fresh corpses. Big Jim's plan was a bit more ambitious, and the payment he expected was a bit higher than the typical $15 paid by colleges. Following Canale's detailed instructions, Logan County gang leader Thomas Sharp picked 4 other gang members. The 5-man team traveled by wagon 30 miles north to Springfield, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln's former home and the location of his tomb. The men rented a 2-story building downtown. They opened a saloon on the first floor and turned the second floor into a dance hall. This gave the team a perfect front for their operation. Gang member Robert Splain worked as a bartender, and the other members drifted in one at a time, just like regular customers. They could meet and talk at the bar without attracting any attention. For particularly secret sessions, they could duck into the back room. Big Jim's orders were to break into Lincoln's tomb, snatch his body, and bury it in a ditch along the Sangamon River a few miles north of town. The disappearance of Lincoln's remains would be front-page news all over the country, of course. The government would offer a huge reward for the return of the body. This is where Big Jim planned to make a personal appearance in the story. Only after the body was planted, Canale was to travel from St. Louis to Springfield. While doing a little fishing in the Sangamon River, he just happened to stumble on Lincoln's shallow grave. Sure, the police would find Canale's chance discovery extremely suspicious, but Canale would have a rock-solid alibi. He was in St. Louis on the night of the theft, with eyewitnesses to prove it. His innocence established, he'd offered to return the body, for the right price, naturally. To get back Lincoln's body, the government was going to have to let Ben Boyd out of jail. Big Jim's final touch was the date of the theft, the night of July 3rd. It was the night before Independence Day, and not just any Independence Day. July 4th, 1876 would be the country's 100th birthday, exactly 1 century from the day Congress approved the Declaration of Independence. By the night of July 3rd, the celebration in town would be well underway. No one would notice a few strangers lurking around Lincoln's tomb. And on July 4th, people in Springfield would be so busy with parades and fireworks that they wouldn't notice Lincoln was missing. Thomas Sharp and the gang prepared carefully for the big night. One by one, on different days, each man took the 2-mile streetcar ride from downtown Springfield to Oak Ridge Cemetery. Each paid the 25-cent admission fee and walked up a muddy path toward the Lincoln Monument to case the joint. Meanwhile, Patrick Tyrrell was still looking for his roper. A roper is basically a double agent who wins the confidence of other counterfeiters and then turns them into the police. Eventually, he found one. His name was Louis Swagles, though he also went by John Morris and a few other phony names. Swagles was in his late 20s, of average height and build. He was talkative, funny, and a natural-born entertainer. He'd grown up in Wisconsin and ran off at 13 to become a sailor. Later, back in the Midwest, he started stealing horses. Like all good ropers, he was known to other criminals and had done time in prison. In the Wisconsin State Penitentiary, he'd met plenty of coney men and had a basic idea of how their world operated. Now Swagles was here in Chicago, married and trying to go straight. Tyrrell was intrigued with Swagles. He went to meet the man whom newspapers would soon proclaim the Prince of Ropers. So Swagels, because he's kind of hard up at this point, actually accepts the job as roper from Tyrrell, and Tyrrell tells him to check out a saloon called The Hub, where this counterfeiter by the name of Hughes was reputed to hang out. On August 28th, while Swagels was drinking and cracking jokes at the bar, Jack Hughes walked in. One of Swagels' new friends pointed Hughes out. Playing it cool, he didn't try to approach Hughes directly. Instead, he hung around at the bar, where small crowds gathered to hear hilarious tales of his past misadventures. Swagels always made sure to casually weave in the names of criminals he'd worked with or befriended behind bars. Swagels noticed that Hughes seemed to enjoy his stories. This gave him an opening. He chatted with the shover and let Hughes know that he was toying with the idea of getting into the coney business himself. Hughes responded with some vague advice. He didn't know Swagels well and had no idea if the man was on the level. He started asking around about Swagels. The stories he'd told about past arrests seemed to check out. Then, during one of his rare stops at another saloon, Hughes spotted a policeman known for bragging about his vast knowledge of criminals. The coney man treated the detective to a few rounds of beer, then asked him what he knew of a man called Louis Swagels. The detective proudly announced, "Why, he is one of the biggest horse thieves in the country." Hughes liked the sound of that. Hughes and another coney man, Mullen, pulled Swagels aside at the Hub. In hushed voices, they asked him if he'd like to make a little money. What was the lay? Body snatching, they told him. Mullen then told Swagels about the plan that he and Hughes had worked out with Big Jim Canally. They were going to take a train to Springfield, bust into the Lincoln Monument, and steal the coffin holding Lincoln's corpse. They'd load the box into a wagon and drive it 220 miles northeast to the sand dunes along the shore of Lake Michigan. The beauty of the dunes was that the wind would quickly blow sand over their wagon tracks. After the body was stashed in the Indiana sand, Big Jim Canally would contact authorities. The terms for the return of Lincoln's body would be simple: Boyd's freedom and $200,000 in cash. Lincoln's monument itself had cost about $200,000 to build. Mullen cackled, "What's the use of the monument without the corpse?" Swagels was too stunned to respond. The silence in the room must have lasted an uncomfortably long time. His friends might think he was losing his nerve. He had to say something. "I'm the boss body snatcher of Chicago," Swagels blurted out. Mullen and Hughes looked intrigued. It was then that the coney men welcomed him to the team. So Swagels went to Springfield to join up with the gang, and Tyrrell went too because he knew all about the plan. It was a cold, overcast morning in Springfield. A steady stream of wagons rolled into the town, packed with men coming in to vote. It was election day. Shop owners swept the sidewalks in front of their stores and arranged displays, expecting a busy day. Patrick Tyrrell, registered as C.A. Demarest, sat in his room in the St. Nicholas Hotel. Swagels knocked on Tyrrell's door and came in to find Detective McGinn and Hay in the room. He shared the latest news and said the plan was to leave for the cemetery at 8:30 p.m. While they were talking, Elmer Washburn showed up along with another Secret Service agent called John McDonald and a third man. Washburn introduced the stranger as John English, a reporter from the Chicago Tribune. Somehow English had picked up rumors of something serious brewing in Springfield, and he'd run into Washburn on the train to town. Washburn agreed to bring him along for the showdown. This must have annoyed Tyrrell, but English would later write the most detailed eyewitness account of the events of the next few hours. Tyrrell went over his plan one last time for the small crowd. He and the other cops would already be in Memorial Hall when the grave robbers arrived. Swagels was to wait until Hughes and Mullen had begun trying to open the marble sarcophagus. Then Swagels would slip out, hurry to the door of Memorial Hall, and whisper the password, "Wash," Washburn's nickname. If for any reason he couldn't get close enough to be heard in a whisper, he should stand in view of the door and light a cigar. At that point, Tyrrell explained, the lawmen would catch the grave robbers red-handed. Swagels left to find Hughes and Mullen. A few minutes later, just after dark, Tyrrell's team climbed into a wagon and headed for the monument. Tyrrell paid the hack driver and told him to turn around and drive right back to the town. just to make sure that when the Coneymen arrived, they wouldn't see anyone near the monument. The team stepped into Memorial Hall and locked the doors behind them. As the men found their spots, the clap of shoe soles on marble seemed to echo like thunder. "Take off your boots," Tyrrell whispered, "and keep quiet." The men waited in their socks, in silence, in the dark. Time seemed to pass very slowly, but there was no way to know for sure as they could not consult their watches. Mullen, Hughes, and Swagles got to the cemetery about 2 hours after Tyrrell's crew. Everything looked good, dark and silent. Mullen reached into the bag, took out a hacksaw, and went to work on the thick padlock securing the inner iron gate. It was slow going, and Mullen spat curses as he dragged the blade back and forth. This was going to take a while, Swagles saw. "I'll make a check," he said, and walked around to the other side of the monument. Tyrrell watched and listened from his spot near the door of Memorial Hall. "Wash." Tyrrell heard the password. He pushed the door open a crack. Swagles stepped forward. In quick whispered words, he told Tyrrell that Mullen and Hughes were sawing the lock. Tyrrell told Swagles to go back and help them. He wasn't ready to pounce yet, not until the thieves could be nabbed actually handling the tomb. Swagles walked back to the catacomb door. Hughes had his hands around the padlock, holding it steady while Mullen worked the saw. They were about a third of the way through when the blade suddenly snapped. "A splendid saw," Mullen muttered. He threw down the broken tool and reached into the bag. "They then got a three-cornered file," Swagles said, and Hughes held the lock while Mullen filed. They took turns at it. It was very hard and slow work. The broken lock fell to the ground. Mullen pushed the gate open and entered the small room. Hughes stepped in with the lantern, followed by Swagles. Hughes pointed the light at the floor. There it was, the long white marble sarcophagus. At one end, carved into the stone, was the name Lincoln. In an arc above the name were the famous words of his second inaugural address, "With malice toward none, with charity for all." Hughes and Mullen crouched beside the marble box, feeling the edges for a weak spot in the construction. Swagles figured this was his chance to slip away. He began backing toward the door. Mullen told him to wait. He needed to hold the lantern. Swagles glanced at the open door, then back to the Coneymen. He considered making a run for it, but then thought of the pistols in his partner's pockets. He played his role perfectly so far. This was no time to panic. He took the lantern. Mullen slid the axe blade under the lid and pushed down on the handle. The lid came right up. He and Swagles lifted the slab off the box and leaned it against the empty crypt reserved for Mary Lincoln, who was still living. Beneath the top slab was a second, heavier marble lid cemented to the box below. They began hacking at the cement seam with the axe and chisels. John English, the reporter, could hear the banging from his spot at the back of the labyrinth. "They're in the catacomb," he told Tyrrell. Tyrrell didn't seem to react. He waited and listened. To this point, everything had gone exactly according to his script. Just a few moments more, and the crooks would have their hands on the coffin. Meanwhile, in the catacomb, the men cracked through the cement seal of Lincoln's sarcophagus. Then they began dragging the coffin out of the marble box. The casket was then pulled out about a foot, Swagles remembered, and it was somewhere between 400 and 500 pounds. The weight wasn't as bad as Mullen and Hughes had feared. 3 men could handle it, though not for long distances. They'd need the wagon nearby. Mullen checked his watch. Nearly 9:30 p.m. "Go get Billy Brown," Mullen told Swagles, "and get him to come help carry this." He warned Swagles not to try coming back up the hill to the monument without signaling first. "We are not going to let anyone come monkeying around here." Mullen and Hughes began gathering the tools as Swagles set down the lantern and ran down the hill, away from the monument. "When I got a bunch of woods between them and me," Swagles said, "I turned sharp to the right and up toward the road leading to Memorial Hall." Tyrrell and his team were waiting inside. They saw a man's figure approaching the door. "Wash!" The door squeaked as Tyrrell swung it open. "You stay here," Tyrrell told the roper, and signaling to the detectives, he said, "Let's go." They all drew their pistols and headed out the door. English followed behind them to watch. Up to this time, he would soon write, everything had worked to a charm. Not a mistake had been made. The moment Tyrrell's feet hit the cold pavement, he realized he hadn't put his boots back on. Too late now, he figured. He hurried on in his socks. The others spread out behind him on the grass. Then suddenly, boom! The unmistakable crack and echo of a gunshot. In the silence of the cemetery, it sounded like a volcanic eruption. Tyrrell turned to the blast. George Hay's pistol was smoking. The thing had accidentally gone off as he ran. The element of surprise was lost. "Come on!" Tyrrell shouted. He sprinted around the monument to the catacomb door and kicked open the unlocked iron gate, pointing his pistol into the dark chamber. "Come out with your hands up!" No response. Tyrrell slid inside, his back flat to the stone wall. His eyes moved uselessly around the tiny space, too dark to see anything. There was no sound, not even breathing. Tyrrell pulled out a match and lit it. The room was empty. "Search the grounds!" Tyrrell roared to his detectives. "They can't have gone far." He ran back outside and again felt the cold ground through his socks. He dashed around the monument, grabbed his boots, pulled them on, and joined the hunt. With a cocked pistol in his hand, Tyrrell started up one of the 4 sets of stairs around the monument. Each staircase led to the terrace surrounding the obelisk, 16 feet above the ground. He got to the top of the stairs and stepped out onto the terrace. About 70 feet in front of him, a figure darted toward a stone column. "Halt!" Tyrrell called, lifting his gun. The figure didn't stop. Tyrrell fired. "Men, come up here!" Tyrrell screamed. "We have the devils up here!" They all came and surrounded the obelisk. There was a short silence. Then, from behind one of the granite pedestals, a man called, "Tyrrell, is that you?" Tyrrell didn't answer. He didn't want to give away his position. "Tyrrell?" the voice called again. "For God's sake, answer! Is that you shooting at us?" The men peeked out from behind the pedestals. Tyrrell lifted his pistol to fire, and in the light of the rising moon, he saw he was aiming at George Hay and John McGinn. "My God," gasped Tyrrell, "what a narrow escape." "Then the villains are gone," groaned Hay. And they really were. Let's go back to the moment Swaggles left the sarcophagus. Something about the setup made them nervous. It's not that they suspected Swaggles of double dealing, but their crook's instincts told them not to stand around in this enclosed space. They'd be safer waiting outside, where they could spot anyone coming, and where escape routes existed. Leaving the tools and the coffin behind, the 2 men jogged down the hill toward the dark line of trees. They lay on the grass out of sight, listening and watching. Just seconds after they reached their spot, they saw shapes moving by the light of the rising moon, black silhouettes against the monument's gray marble. Swaggles and Brown? No, there were too many. 4 or 5 figures at least. Then came the explosion of Hay's pistol. At that point, Hughes and Mullen jumped up and darted through the woods toward the nearest fence. They climbed over and started sprinting down the street. By dawn, they were many miles from Springfield. So these fools never even got Lincoln's body, and the plot was pretty much a fail. But not as much of a fail as Tyrrell's plan to capture them that night. I mean, Tyrrell had all the cards in his hand, and he just couldn't make it. Anyway, if you want to see what happened to Hughes and Mullen and the other men in the plot, you'll have to buy the book. It's called Lincoln's Grave Robbers by Steve Sheinkin. Because that's the whole point of this podcast, is for young Catholic gentlemen to read more, and especially very good and moral stories, preferably about history. So, happy reading, and Godspeed.